In the late autumn of 1883, in the high desert country south of Pueblo, Colorado, there was a chuckwagon that nobody wanted. It had been sitting behind the livery on Crane Street for 11 months, its canvas cover long rotted away, its iron wheel rims rusted to the color of old blood, its sideboards warped by a summer of relentless sun and 2 early autumn rains. The tongue was cracked along the grain, and propped on a cedar post someone had wedged under it to keep the whole frame from listing into the dirt. The bed was full of blown grit and 3 seasons of pigeon work. The auctioneer, a man named Colfax with a red mustache and a habit of looking at the sky when he named a price he did not believe in, had brought it up twice before, and both times received nothing. On a Thursday morning in October, when the air carried the first real cold off the mountains and the crowd at the livery yard was thin, he tried a third time. He named $4. He waited. He named $3. A young woman at the back of the crowd raised her hand. Her name was Nora Pell. She was 26 years old. She had 41 cents in her coat pocket after she paid for the wagon. The men around her made no sound, which is sometimes worse than laughter. Colfax wrote her name in his ledger without looking up and moved on to the next item, a one-eared mule that drew considerably more interest. The man beside Nora, a freighter named Dobbs who smelled of pipe ash, said quietly that she had bought herself a fine place to store feed sacks, provided the bottom did not fall through first. She did not answer him. She was already walking toward the wagon. If you have ever watched someone who truly knows a craft approach a piece of work, you will recognize what Nora did in the first hour after she paid for the wagon. She did not touch it immediately. She walked around it twice at a distance of about 4 feet, looking at the whole shape, the way the frame sat, which wheel was worst, where the sideboards had pulled apart from the bed rails. She crouched and looked under the bed at the running gear. She stood and checked the angle of the reach, which is the long timber connecting the front and rear axle assemblies, and which on a chuck wagon carries most of the stress of a loaded run across rough ground. She pressed the warped sideboards with her thumb, feeling for the difference between surface weathering and rot that had gone through to the fiber. The near front wheel was the worst. The rim had separated from one of the felloes, the curved wooden segments that made up the wheel's outer ring, and the gap was wide enough to admit 2 fingers. The spokes, though, were sound on all 4 wheels. The hub iron was tight. The axle trees had not sprung and showed no sign of being overloaded in the past. Someone had built the running gear with care once, and the care was still there underneath 11 months of abandonment. She knelt at the rear and examined the reach more carefully. The timber was straight. The iron gussets fitted at the joint points were a style she recognized from her grandfather, who had used the same design. A triangular iron plate bolted to either side of the main timber at each joint, spreading the load rather than concentrating it. She had seen it in his shop in Ohio before he died, in a photograph her father had kept, and she had seen her father use the same method on the high-sided freight wagons he had built for a hauling firm in Kansas when Nora was 12 years old and spending her summer school break standing next to the work. There is a particular kind of person who looks at a broken thing and sees what it was before it broke, not what it could be with money poured into it, not what it might become with enough optimism, but what it actually was, the shape of it underneath the ruin, the engineering that made it and that still holds even when the surface has come apart. Nora Pell was that kind of person because her father had made her that kind of person, and her father had learned it from his father before that, down through a line of men and one woman who had spent their working lives building the things that kitchens and camps and cattle outfits ran on. Her grandfather, whose name was Cale, had come to the territories from Ohio in 1851 as a wagon builder's apprentice and had spent 30 years learning the trade so thoroughly that by the end he could look at any wheeled vehicle of the period and tell you within a season when it had been made, who had built the running gear, and whether the joinery in the bed would hold under a loaded run across rough ground. He could identify a maker's hand the way a reader identifies a familiar typeface, by the way the man solved the problems that every wagon builder eventually faced: the swell of the hubs, the angle of the spokes, the width of the iron tire in proportion to the expected load. Cale had taught Nora's father, not by lecturing but by standing beside the work and pointing and waiting, the way that knowledge has always been transmitted when it is knowledge that lives in the hands. Her father, whose name was Ross Pell, had died of a lung illness in the spring of 1881, 2 years before the morning in the livery yard. He had been 53 years old and had not finished the set of farm wagons he was building for a ranch outside Dodge City when the illness found him. Nora had finished the wagons herself, spending 6 weeks in the shop with his tools and his drawings and the half-built frames he had left, and had delivered them and been paid, and used the money to keep herself through the winter of 1881 and into the following year. The tools he had used were in a canvas roll on Nora's pack horse, a set of spoke shaves and chisels he had kept sharp enough to shave with, a draw knife with a hickory handle he had replaced 3 times on the same blade, and a folding rule she had never seen him work without. She carried them with the automatic care that most people reserve for things they know to be valuable. They were. She had come to Pueblo in September looking for work at the freighting yard on Mesa Street, where she had heard through a letter from a woman in her mother's congregation that a new outfit was fitting wagons for the southern run. The outfit, it turned out, had been sold before she arrived, and the new owner did not hire women for anything involving the wagons themselves. He had been polite about it. That was October. The 41 cents in her pocket was what remained of the money she had carried out of Trinchera, where she had spent 3 weeks doing finish work on a farm wagon for a man who had paid 2/3 of the agreed price, and then developed business elsewhere. She could not afford to winter in Pueblo without work. She could not afford to leave it without something to sell, or a way to earn. The Chuckwagon was what the money gave her. She stood in front of it in the October morning with her hand on the sideboards and thought about what the work would cost in time and materials against what the finished wagon might fetch. A sound Chuckwagon in working condition was worth $40 at minimum to any cattle outfit fitting up for the spring season. A well-built one with the bed properly squared and the running gear true could bring 60. The materials she would need: new lumber for the sideboards and the tongue spliced, iron for the wheel rim, oakum and pitch for the seams, would run $10 to $12 if she was careful. The work was hers. She had no labor cost but her own time. The arithmetic was not comfortable, but it was arithmetic that had a solution. She had worked from worse starts. Then she opened the toolbox. The Chuckwagon toolbox was a standard feature of any cattle drive wagon, a compartment built into the rear of the wagon bed, behind the chuck box where the cook stored provisions, accessible from the outside by a drop-down door that served as a work surface. On a working outfit, it held the tools a cook or a wrangler might need on the range: punches and pliers and a cold chisel, sometimes a spare cinch ring or two, sometimes a broken harness piece someone had never gotten around to mending. On an abandoned wagon that had sat behind a livery for 11 months, it should have held nothing but rust and grit. The door was secured by a hasp and a padlock that had been painted over at some point, and then had rusted inside its own paint shell. Nora worked it for 10 minutes with the smaller of her chisels and a strip of iron she found in the gutter beside the livery fence. The lock gave, not from picking but from the rusted shackle shearing through at the base where the metal had thinned to a film. The door swung down on its leather hinges. What was inside was not tools. There were tools in the technical sense: a farrier's rasp, a cold chisel, a pair of nippers with a cracked handle. Those were on top. Under them, wrapped in oilskin that had kept better than anything else on that wagon, were 4 items that were not tools in any ordinary sense of the word. The first was a ledger book, standard accountant's size, its covers water-stained at the corners but the interior pages dry, written in a small, precise hand, in brown ink. The second was a folded paper, heavier stock, which opened to show a surveyed land plat for a section of territory that she did not yet recognize, with several parcels marked in red ink along what appeared to be a creek drainage. The third was a letter, 2 pages, addressed to a man named Aurelia Vega, care of a ranch address south of the Greenhorn Mountains. The fourth was a deed. Nora stood with the door swung open and the oilskin laid across the wagon bed and the October wind picking up off the mountains. She held the deed and read it carefully, the way her father had taught her to read any document involving property, starting with the legal description and working toward the names, because the description is the fact, and the names are only the people the facts have happened to. The legal description named 240 acres along Badito Creek in Huerfano County, Colorado Territory. The deed was dated July of 1877 and bore the recorded signature of 2 parties. One was the Territorial Land Office agent, whose name was printed below in official form, and the other was a man named Cormac Pruitt. The deed recorded the transfer of the 240 acres from Aurelio Vega to Cormac Pruitt for $1 in consideration and other valuable exchanges. $1 for 240 acres of creek bottom land in Huerfano County. Nora set the deed down on the oilskin with the same careful flatness that her father had taught her to use when setting an edge tool on a workbench. She picked up the ledger and opened it. If the deed had been strange, the ledger was a record of how strange it had gotten. The entries ran from January of 1876 through the spring of 1877. They were written in 2 hands, one neat and one less so, and what they recorded was a series of loans, sums advanced to a party identified throughout only as AV, against the security of land and livestock. The amounts were not large at first. $20 in January, $15 in March, $40 in the summer for what the neat hand noted was feed bought against a drought year. By the end of 1876, the total was $230, and the interest column, calculated quarterly at a rate the neat hand had specified on the first page at 12% compounded, had grown to make the principal look modest. The second, less careful hand appeared first in October of 1876. Its entries were shorter. They recorded payments, or rather the absence of them, in a language that was technically neutral and practically a noose. Balance outstanding. Payment not received. Note extended at lender's discretion. Collateral value confirmed by lender's agent. The last entry, in March of 1877, was in the neat hand. It recorded the settlement of the outstanding balance. The settlement was the deed. Nora read through it twice. Then she picked up the letter. The letter was in Spanish, which she could read with effort, her mother having grown up in a household where it was the first language. It was addressed to Aurelio Vega and signed by a woman whose name was Dolores Medina, and whose relation to Vega she placed after a moment as a sister or sister-in-law, from the way the letter addressed him. The letter was not about the land or the debt. It was about a child, a son, and about the family's situation after the loss of the land, and about whether Vega intended to contest the transfer or accept it. The letter's tone was not accusing. It was exhausted in the way that people are exhausted when something has been lost that cannot be recovered, and the only question remaining is how to carry the fact of the loss. She did not know, standing at the open toolbox of a ruined chuckwagon in a livery yard in Pueblo, whether the deed was valid or fraudulent. She did not know whether the loan had been fairly made or engineered to fail. She did not know who Cormac Pruitt was now, or where he was, or whether the land he had taken was still in his possession or had been sold on twice since. What she knew was how to find out. She wrapped the documents back in the oilskin carefully and in the order she had found them, and closed the toolbox door. She would need a new padlock for it eventually. For now, she braced the door shut with a loop of rope from her pack, tied to the hasp, and stood back and looked at the wagon in the growing morning light. Her father had told her once that a wagon's secrets live in its joinery, not in the wood itself, which is only material, and not in the iron, which is only strength, but in the way the maker has put the two together. The mortise and the tenon, the bolt and the countersink, the decision about where a joint should be rigid and where it should have a degree of play to absorb the road. A wagon built by someone who understood those choices would last 40 years. One built by someone who did not would fail the first time real weight was put through it. She had recognized the joinery in the Chuckwagon the moment she walked around it. The running gear was sound. The reach was straight and had been fitted with iron gussets at the joints that spoke of a builder who had thought about the load distribution. The surface was ruined. The structure was not. Someone had built that wagon with intention, and someone else had let it go to ruin through neglect or loss, or simple bad luck. And the things inside it had been sealed in the only watertight compartment it possessed. They had been waiting for the right person to open it. If you are wondering what a woman with 41 cents to her name does next, when she has found documents in a stranger's toolbox that may point to a wrong done 6 years ago, to people she has never met, the answer in Nora's case was that she did not rush. She spent 2 more hours at the wagon, taking careful notes on what repairs it needed and in what order, and making a rough accounting in her head of the time each step would take. She wanted to understand the full shape of what she had bought before she did anything else with it. There was a woman in Pueblo named Clara Foss, who kept a notary's office on 2nd Street, and who had, in addition to her official function, a reputation for knowing where public records were kept and how to read them. Nora found her the following morning. She laid the documents on the woman's desk without explanation and waited while Clara Foss read through them with the precise attention of someone for whom the difference between a recorded deed and a fraudulent one was a professional matter and not an abstraction. Clara Foss was 60 years old, had come to Colorado in 1863 with a husband who had died in 1870, and had built her notarial practice on the principle that a woman who understood documents in a territory full of men who had signed documents without reading them was a woman who would never lack for work. She read the ledger first, then the deed, then the plat, then the letter. She looked up after a while. "You found these," she said. "In a toolbox," Nora said. Clara Foss considered that. "The interest calculation on this ledger is not how a legal loan instrument reads in this territory," she said, tapping the ledger with one finger. "This compounding schedule would have been unenforceable, and the consideration stated on this deed is not what the law requires for a valid transfer of real property in excess of 100 acres. Nora said, "Is the deed recorded?" "If it was recorded, it will be in Huerfano County," Clara Foss said. "And if the man who drew it knew what he was doing, it is recorded. That doesn't make it legal. It makes it harder to undo." She paused. "Is the Vega family still in the territory?" "I don't know yet," Nora said. That was a Wednesday. By Saturday, she had walked most of it out. The county seat of Huerfano County was Walsenburg, 40 miles south on the road that followed the Cucharas River. Nora had no money for the stage. She had the Chuckwagon, which she had spent 2 days making roadworthy. She had spliced a new tongue from a green timber she had cut from a cottonwood at the creek's edge, bolted it to the front bolster, the loose wheel reseated on its hub with a hickory wedge driven tight, and the rim resecured with a length of flat iron she had heated in the livery's forge and worked herself one wheel at a time, while the stable hand watched in the careful way that people watch. Work they do not understand and are reluctant to admit impresses them. The near horse was her own. The off horse she hired for the drive south and the promise of a return once she had concluded her business. She arrived in Walsenburg on a Monday afternoon and went directly to the county recorder's office, which occupied the ground floor of a building on the main street that had been intended as a bank and finished as something more modest. The walls were bare plaster, and the floor was wide-board pine that had been sanded and oiled recently, and the shelves that lined 3 walls held deed books and plat books and record volumes in the careful arrangement of a man who had organized the room once and intended it to stay that way. The recording clerk was a small man named Hughes, who had been in the job for 6 years and who treated every inquiry with the same level of neutral efficiency, which Nora found comfortable. She stated what she was looking for. He produced the deed book for 1877. She found the entry in 11 minutes. The deed was recorded. The transfer was on the books. She sat for a moment with the deed book open in front of her and thought about her father's rule regarding wood grain. Work with it, not against it. A piece of lumber cut across the grain would look right until you put weight through it, and then it would fail at exactly the point where the grain ran wrong. A piece cut true would hold. The deed had been recorded. It looked right from the front of the ledger. What she needed was to find where the grain ran wrong. She asked Hughes if there was a land surveyor who worked the county and gave her a name, a man named Alder who had an office on the street behind the recorder. She went there next. Alder was a lean man in his 50s who had surveyed most of the land in Huerfano County personally, and who, when she spread the plat on his table, looked at it for a long moment before he said anything. "This is Badito Creek land," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "This parcel here," he said, touching the red-marked section with one finger. This was under a homestead filing in 1874. The Vega family. Aurelio Vega filed and proved up. I ran the survey myself. He looked at the deed. He looked at the plat. He looked at the ledger number she had copied onto a sheet of paper in Clara Foss's office before she left Pueblo. A 12% compound quarterly note on a man whose language was not English and who had no legal counsel, he said, not as a question. "That is what the ledger says," Nora said. Alder was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who had spent decades working outdoors in country that did not reward agitation. "The family is still here," he said at last. "The son farms a small piece of land east of town. He wouldn't know to contest a deed that's been sitting in the county books for 6 years. He looked at her across the table. "How did you come by this?" She told him about the Chuckwagon, about the livery yard in Pueblo, about the oilskin in the toolbox that was not full of tools, about the padlock that had rusted through at its own base. Alder was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he said that Pruitt had sold the land in 1880 and was in Los Animas County now, and that the land had passed to a grazing outfit that had been running cattle on it since. Nora thought about that. She thought about what her father had said once about a wagon that had been repaired badly, that fixing it wrong was a second injustice to the wood, because the wood had been good to begin with. The first injustice was the damage. The second was the repair that pretended the damage had not happened. The only honest thing was to take the repair apart and do it over from where the grain was still sound. She asked Alder if he would write down what he knew about the survey and the filing and the sequence of transfers. He said he would. She asked if he knew a lawyer in Walsenburg who handled land cases. He gave her a name. The lawyer, whose name was Garvey, was a spare, methodical man who read the documents she brought him without any expression, and then sat back and steepled his fingers and looked at the ceiling for what felt like a long time. "The note is unenforceable under territorial statute as written," he said at last. "The interest rate and the compounding schedule both exceed the legal limit. That makes the debt settlement, meaning this deed, a transaction that could be challenged on the grounds that the consideration was not freely given." "Can it be undone?" Nora asked. "At this remove," he said, "not entirely. Pruitt sold to the grazing outfit in good faith, and they have been on the land for 3 years. They are not the party who committed the fraud." He paused. "There is, in territorial law, a provision for compensatory restitution, where a recorded deed is shown to have been obtained through an illegal instrument. The fraudulent party, meaning Pruitt's estate or assigns, is liable for the assessed value of the land at the time of transfer." "Which was," Nora said. "In 1877, Badito Creek bottomland was selling for $4 an acre at minimum," Garvey said. 240 acres at $4 is $960. Nora said nothing for a moment. "Against $1 in recorded consideration," she said. "Yes," Garvey said. She left the documents with him. Not the originals which she had wrapped back in the oilskin and replaced in the toolbox that now sat in the wagon in Garvey's yard, but the careful copy she had made in Foss's office, attested by Foss's notarial seal. Garvey said he would need 2 weeks to file the preliminary petition and locate Pruitt's assets in Los Animas County, and that he would need to speak with the Vega family. She asked if she could be present for that conversation. He thought about it and said yes, he did not see why not. The Vega family, which was now represented primarily by a man named Ezra Vega, who was 31 years old and farmed 12 acres of dry benchland east of Walsenburg with his wife and his wife's mother, received Garvey and Nora on a Thursday afternoon in a kitchen that was clean and spare and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking in a covered pot. The house was adobe, solid in its walls, and the yard outside showed the careful use of scarce water. A kitchen garden with the last of the autumn greens still in the ground, a small woodpile squared and covered against rain, a fence of cedar posts strung with 2 courses of wire that had been kept taut. Ezra Vega listened to Garvey's explanation with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to make quick judgments about information that seemed too good. He was a still man, not in the way that some men are still because they lack animation, but in the way that comes from years of learning to carry weight without showing it. The particular stillness of someone who has lived with an unresolved wrong long enough that he has built his life around the fact of it, rather than around any expectation of its repair. When Garvey finished, Ezra Vega looked at Nora. "You bought a broken wagon," he said. "For $3, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father signed that deed," he said. "I was 12. He told me it was the only way to clear the debt. He believed that. He looked at the table. He believed a lot of things that were not true." Nora thought about the letter she had read in the toolbox, the one in Spanish, the sister's exhausted voice asking what Aurelio Vega intended to do. She thought about the fact that he had apparently done nothing, or had not been able to do anything, and had carried the loss for the remaining years of his life, and that Ezra Vega had inherited the carrying. She did not say any of that. There was nothing useful she could add to what Garvey had already laid out. What she said instead was plain. The documents were with Mr. Garvey. They had been sealed in oilskin for 6 years and were in good condition. The ledger was complete. The plat was clear. Ezra Vega nodded once. It was the nod of a man who has been handed something he did not expect and doesn't yet know how to hold. His wife, who had been at the stove through most of the conversation and had not spoken, set 2 cups of coffee on the table without ceremony. Garvey took his. Nora took hers. Outside the kitchen window, the dry bench stretched east in the low winter light, pale as bleached cotton. The distances long and the sky above them the particular faded blue of high altitude in December. Garvey filed the petition in the second week of November. Nora had stayed in Walsenburg, working in the meantime on the Chuckwagon, which she had pulled into a yard behind the livery where she was boarding her horses. The work she did on it in those 2 weeks was the full kind, not the minimum necessary to make it roadworthy, but the kind her father had meant when he said that a thing worth doing was worth doing, back to its grain. She began with the sideboards. The originals were warped beyond saving in 2 of the 4 panels, so she bought new lumber from the mill at the edge of town and spent 2 days shaping and fitting the replacements, working the pieces until they sat flat in their rails, and the iron fasteners could be driven home without pulling the wood. The other 2 panels she steamed and straightened over a form she rigged from green pine, weighting the boards until the warp released and the grain remembered its own direction. When all 4 were fitted and set, the bed was square for the first time in what she estimated was several years. The wheel rims were next. She pulled each in sequence, working alone, and carried them to the blacksmith Ortez's forge, where she had rented forge time from him 3 days running. Ortez watched her work with an evaluating eye on the first day and said nothing. On the second day, he asked her where she had learned to set a wheel rim, and she told him about her father and her grandfather, and he was quiet with that for a while and then went back to his own work without comment. On the third day, he heated her iron for her without being asked, which was the only endorsement he offered and which was sufficient. She replaced the tongue entirely, cutting the new piece from a section of straight-grained oak she found at the mill, and fitting it to the front bolster with the same iron gusset method her grandfather had used and that she had found in the wagon's original reach, a triangular plate on either side, bolts driven true, the joint made tight before the final draw. She caulked the seams of the bed with oakum and laid pitch over the oakum and let it set 2 days in the cold air. The chuck box she rebuilt from the platform out, replacing the rotted shelf dividers with sound ash and refitting the hinged door so that it hung level and closed without binding. The leather hinges she cut herself from a piece of heavy harness leather she bought from the saddler on the main street for 60 cents, soaking them overnight and working them supple before fitting. The toolbox she repaired last. She replaced the rusted hasp and hung a new padlock on it, a sturdy iron one she bought at the hardware. She lined the interior with fresh oilskin. She left it empty because the things that had been inside it were in Garvey's care now and not coming back. The padlock she left open, closed but not locked. In December, Garvey sent word that Pruitt's assets in Los Animas County included a quarter section of irrigated land and a small freighting contract with a mercantile outfit in Trinidad. The Los Animas County Court, presented with the petition and the attached documentation, had issued a judgment requiring compensatory payment from Pruitt's holdings. The assessed value at the time of the 1877 transfer was placed at $840, adjusted for the legal interest on the outstanding 6 years. It was not the land. The land could not be returned. That was what Garvey had said from the beginning. It was the money the land had been worth at the moment it was taken, and the acknowledgment in the county record that the taking had been illegal. The county record, when Hughes entered the judgment at Garvey's instruction, would stand on the same shelf as the original deed, in the same deed book, on the page following the fraudulent transfer. Anyone who looked up the parcel in years to come would find both entries, the taking and the reckoning, one after the other in the plain language of the law. Ezra Vega used part of the settlement to buy 30 acres of creek-bottom land east of his dry bench, land with water on it and soil that would carry a proper crop. He did not say much about it to Nora when she came to say she was leaving Walsenburg. He was not an effusive man. He said that his father had stored the wagon at a cousin's barn outside Pueblo for safekeeping after the family left the Creekland, and that the cousin had died in 1880 and the barn had passed to a stranger, and the wagon had eventually ended up at the livery. He hadn't known what had happened to the documents. He hadn't known they still existed. He said that last part looking out at the dry bench where he had farmed 12 acres with his wife and her mother for 6 years since he came back to the county. The bench looked the same as it always did at that hour, the light flat and the ground pale. But there were 30 acres of bottomland now on the other side of it that would look different in the spring when the water came down and the soil turned dark. He hid them in the toolbox, Nora said. Your father. Ezra Vega considered that. He would have thought he could come back for them, he said. He always thought he would find a way to come back. There was nothing Nora could add to that. She did not try. She left Walsenburg on a Tuesday in December with the rebuilt Chuckwagon and both horses and a sale agreed with a freighting outfit in Pueblo that had offered her a fair price for the wagon once they had seen the work she had done on it. She had driven it back up the Couturus Road in 3 days, the new tongue holding and the rim work true on all 4 wheels, the wagon running straighter and more quietly than any $3 wagon had a right to. The figure the freighting outfit had named was $60. It was more than she had expected and less than the wagon was worth, and she took it because she needed the money and because the wagon had done what it was supposed to do, and its work was finished. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to give something up that you have labored over and set right, the answer is not grief, or not only grief. There is a different thing underneath it, the particular satisfaction of a job finished clean, of a problem solved back to its root rather than patched at the surface. She understood that feeling, had been made to understand it by 2 generations of men who had worked wood and iron until the work said what it was supposed to say. She felt it standing in the freighting yard when the new owners ran their hands along the bed rails and inspected the wheel rims and looked at the joinery of the chuck box with the professional attention of men who moved things for a living and knew what a well-built wagon felt like. One of them opened the toolbox. He looked inside at the empty oilskin-lined interior and the open padlock hanging from the hasp. He looked at Nora. Nothing in it, he said. No, she said. He closed the door. He did not think much about it. There were a dozen things he needed to load into the yard before the end of the day, and the wagon was only one of them. Nora pocketed the $60 and untied her horse from the hitching rail and led it out of the yard and onto Crane Street, where the cold had settled in for what looked like a long stay, and the mountains to the west were carrying new snow on their upper slopes. She had enough money to winter in Pueblo now and enough reputation, after Garvey had made quiet mention of her work in Walsenburg to 2 men he knew in the freighting trade, to expect work in the spring. One of them had already sent a letter to the livery where she was boarding, asking if she would be available to look at a set of freight wagons in March that needed their running gear overhauled. She had written back that she would. She had, in the pocket of her coat along with the $60, the draw knife with the hickory handle. It went everywhere she went. It always had. Her father had given it to her on the last day he worked the shop, before the illness took him from the bench to the bed, and then further on. He had not made a speech about it. He had simply held it out, and she had taken it. And they had both understood what the transfer meant without saying so. At the end of Crane Street, she paused and turned her coat collar up against the wind off the mountains. The livery yard was behind her, 2 blocks back, empty now of the wagon that had sat there for 11 months with its toolbox locked and its secret sealed against the weather. The yard had already been swept for the next sale. There was nothing there to mark that the wagon had been there. or what had come out of it. The deed book in Huerfano County would carry that record forward. The ledger, notarized and attested, would sit in Garvey's office files. 30 acres of creek-bottom land would be breaking open in April, the first time water had run across it for a vega since 1877. Those things would persist. The yard was just a yard. The work that needed doing had been done. The grain had run true. She turned her horse toward the south end of town and the stable where she had taken a week's board, and she went.